Once there was a family of 3 geeky little bears who decided to read this strange new genre called science fiction. The first reader, the traditional and wise Papa Bear, opened his 600-page hardcover showing rivets on the cover, read 2 chapters, and then rumbled his approval. "This science fiction is hard," said he. The second reader, the curious and considerate Mama Bear, opened her 220-page paperback that featured rocket ships in the background behind a swooning couple, then read only a few pages before sighing with contentment. "This science fiction is soft," said she. Which books did they read, and what is the difference?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome aboard the good ship, Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where our mission is to explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm Steven Burnett, you're a good captain and podcaster, publisher of Lorehaven.com, and also author of a new science fiction adventure novel launching in 2 months from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, doing my best not to touch all the polaron inverters and other strange flashing buttons. This is episode 246, What is Soft Science Fiction? And we'll be talking today with Clint Hall about his book, Echo Nova.
But what's beneath all of those flashing buttons? Probably just a bunch of wires and watch batteries. There may be some machinery down in there that's best left to the imagination. And that's one difference that soft science fiction has from hard science fiction. I'm looking forward to this episode, but I imagine a bunch of our listeners now are looking forward to the resolution of that story. What was Baby Bear reading? Well, he was reading, of course, the science fiction that wasn't too hard and wasn't too soft. It was just right. What is that book? Well, that's the one that you're enjoying right now if you enjoy science fiction. Or it may be Clint Hall's new novel, Echo Nova, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Fresh off the presses from Enclave Publishing, so he's going to be a good neighbor to me personally. Also hot off the press is Lorehaven.com with our articles. We just had a 1-2 punch duet of articles from 2 different writers, Josiah DeGraff and A.D. Sheehan, about this new Brandon Sanderson novel, which isn't even science fiction hard or soft. It's fantasy, but it's given some people a hard time because of some subject matter in there. Great things to say about Brandon Sanderson, of course, but also some controversy. You can find those at Lorehaven.com and subscribe free to get those articles and these podcast episodes in your inbox when we release them weekly. You can also join the Lorehaven Guild, our castle in the cloud on Discord, where we engage in discussion about books, talk about these episodes, kind of an inside channel for what we're planning for the podcast and what's coming up for the Lorehaven mission, which includes, as I mentioned, Echo Nova, which also happens to be our top sponsor for this episode, courtesy of top sponsor Enclave Publishing. Clint Hall's coming in just a moment, but let's talk about the story first. Dash Keen is about to become the biggest star in history. As a poor teenager living in the dregs, Dash Keen can only escape his dismal reality by competing in illegal rooftop races and staying up late to watch the TimeNet with his younger brother. When there is an opportunity to participate in a competition set thousands of years in the past, he uses his rooftop racer skills to catch the eye of Mr. Mirtram, head of entertainment for the massive Dominus Corporation. And yes, I'll get that pronunciation guide late in just a moment from our guest. It is the chance of a lifetime when Dominus Corp hires Dash to be a time star, the focus of his own series in which he must survive some of the most dangerous periods in history, including the Cretaceous, feudal Japan, the Wild West, and the golden age of piracy. But when empathy for the people of the past conflicts with the desires of his new employer, he must decide whether the price of fame is worth it. a decision that may cost him everything. Enclave Escape presents Echo Nova by Clint Hall, available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon, or for 20% off the hardcover at enclavepublishingstore.com. It is also available in audio from Oasis Audio. You can see that fantastic cover, which had a fantastic cover reveal event at Realm Makers last year. Go to it at the show notes for this episode 246, or see that and all the other sponsors and episodes at lorehaven.com/podcast. We have prepared the time platform. There's about to be a flash of, there it is, flash of light. Wow, huge sound effect that you couldn't really hear because it's that kind of podcast. Let's go welcome our guest, Clint Hall.
Okay, are y'all sports guys at all? I've totally derailed your podcast already. Are y'all sports? Are y'all into basketball?
Aggie football. That's all I follow.
Aggie football.
Zach can be the sports guy. I'm the sci-fi guy. Clint, hard or soft?
I'm the soft.
Obviously, he's been around here sometimes.
Because here's the thing: people, the little slim area where sports fans will overlap with sci-fi fans might appreciate this. The idea of getting dunked on, because I feel like that's what I'm walking into, about to have this conversation with the two of you. That I am by far the least capable person, I think, of talking at an expert level about sci-fi with the two of you. I'm just here to learn.
Too late, Clint. You're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm
Absolutely.
so excited to have this conversation.
Because I want to start with a softball question, though, Clint. How exactly does the time travel work? Did you bring flowcharts?
Yeah. That's a really good question. No. So
it's a box with lights.
This right, exactly. No, you just kind of get in the middle of it and you just wait, and then you go back or forth through time. You know, it's an interesting thing though, because there's a difference, I think, and I know we're going to get into this between hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi, and Echo Nova is certainly softer sci-fi. But just because you don't perhaps explain, look, I'm the last person who needs to come on here and talk about string theory, right? But just because I'm not going to go very deep into the science behind it, the math and all that kind of stuff, quantum physics, what have you, there is a logic though, right? And that still is very important. And I think good soft sci-fi is going to keep that in mind. So it's more about sort of the logic behind the way that time travel works. So for example, right, in Echo Nova, the way I describe it is that time is like a stream of water trickling down the sidewalk, okay? In the present, we are at the very, very tip of that stream, okay? We can't go forward in the future because it doesn't exist yet. It hasn't happened yet. But with every passing moment, that stream is getting longer and longer and longer, which means that you can move back to the past, okay? And when you go back to the past, it's very, very, very intensive to try to open a portal to the past. It takes a lot of energy to do so. But if you can manage to do it, and you go back and you change something, it does create a ripple, okay? But those ripples are moving at the same speed as the rest of the time stream down the water, which means if you go back and you change something, it doesn't necessarily impact the present, because those ripples of change, it's too bad people can't see me, those ripples of change are moving at the same speed as the present. So you go down and cut down a tree 20 years ago, by the time it catches up to us right here in 2025, sorry to timestamp the podcast here, by the time it catches up to us in 2025, we've moved on to 2045 and we still have our tree. So that's how time travel works, right? In Echo Nova, without me going into, string theory and quantum mechanics and all the other things that I am ill-equipped to talk about.
Well, there's some audience considerations there too, Clint. We mentioned there in the sponsor segment that Echo Nova is from Enclave Escape. So you're not writing this for nerds who want to theorize about time travel or draw equations on a whiteboard whilst in a white lab coat or something. This is for young adult readers. It's going to be more personally focused. The description there does not open with, in the year 2053, a secret research institution discovered the secret to time travel, and so on and so on, and then barely even mentions a main character or a quest or a relatable characteristic about them. But this story starts with Dash Keen. I always like a back cover that just leads straight off with the name of the main character. This tells me, as a human being who wants to read stories about other humans, this is going to be a human story. This isn't a more highfalutin or more high speculative, harder type science fiction story. And so that's what intrigues me about Echo Nova, just like I've been intrigued by your first novel, Steal Fire from the Gods.
Wow.
Perfectly fine literary title that just begs for a stentorian pronunciation there. So when I proposed this episode to you, I thought, some people may have a stereotype in mind about the phrase soft science fiction. As if it's just for softies, it's barely science fiction, but that's not true. Science fiction is a spectrum. There's different kinds of stories all along this classification. But let's start then just from your perspective, Clint, and how you came into this business, whether you tried hard sci-fi at the beginning or what. I'm curious, Clint and Zach as well, like what to you does the phrase hard science fiction mean? What does the label bring to mind for you?
And again, and I'm glad you put it that way with bring to mind, because in my whole like way too long thing about y'all dunking on me at the beginning, it was basically my way of saying I'm not an expert here, right? I am a traveler on this road just like everybody else. Because when y'all asked me to come on this podcast, I had to ask myself, well, what is the difference between hard sci-fi and soft? I always felt like I had an answer, but sometimes you have to force yourself to articulate it before you realize, okay, this is what I really think it is. I've never really considered myself a hard sci-fi person, and nor nothing I write is ever very intentional, truly. I didn't set out to necessarily make Echo Nova YA or adult. The same thing was true with Steal Fire, and I kind of felt like either book kind of could have gone either way, really. Some of the themes in Steal Fire are a little more mature than the themes that are in Echo Nova, and I do think that that's the difference maker. So when I think about hard sci-fi, my favorite example, and the reason why this is my favorite example is because I do think it challenges some of the misconceptions. My favorite example is The Martian, because The Martian is, I went to Worldcon it must have been about 10 years ago or so now. It was not long after The Martian came out, and people at Worldcon were raving about The Martian. There was an astronaut up on stage. I think it was the year The Martian won the Hugo or something. Astronaut up on stage talking about, Andy Weir, he got the science right. And that's what everybody was praising about that book. Rightfully so. That was not the reason why I loved The Martian. I loved The Martian because of the voice, because of the sense of humor. Now, fittingly, his voice and his sense of humor reminded me of a lot of my friends who do understand string theory and quantum mechanics and all of those other things. So it was very appropriate for that type of a book. They would be closer to the type of people who would be more likely to write and read hard sci-fi. But I think a lot of times we think of hard sci-fi and we think that it has to be dark and, like extremely detail oriented, and it is, but that doesn't mean that it can't be light. That doesn't mean that it can't be driven. I still feel like The Martian was very character driven, again, because Andy did such a great job with that writing voice. So when I think of hard sci-fi, I do think that the difference is that essentially that there's a focus on scientific accuracy. I think that's really what it comes down to, that this is something that could actually happen, and we're going to talk about the ways that it could happen. And in The Martian, it's actually, getting to Mars, of course, but actually it's more about how he gets off of Mars and then how resourceful he is in getting off of Mars. Versus something like Echo Nova, which is a little bit more like, hey, just trust me, like this time travel works, or trust me, we have hyperdrives, right? And that sort of thing. And that's kind of like, because that's your conceit, right? That's because it's like, hey, listen, the story isn't really about me trying to prove to you how smart I am. I'm just trying to tell you a story. And I think that having these advanced, not currently possible technologies or whatever could then impact humanity in a certain way that would be interesting in these other ways. And I'm more interested in exploring those impacts than speculating about the technology itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good definition. I've also heard it said hard sci-fi is when the science is the main character, and I don't mean a certain famous scientist. We won't get into that, but when science is something important to the planet. Yeah, more so when the reader can understand the science that's being used, and it's real science, like you said. There's accuracy in the science, and I'm actually going to draw a distinction here. Stephen may disagree with me. It's when there is no technobabble, and I'll talk about a really good example of technobabble in chapter 2. But I think hard sci-fi means there's zero technobabble. It's all understandable. And more importantly, a reader can put together sort of a good prediction of what's going to happen next based on what science has been discussed and revealed, sort of like a detective story where the reader can guess who done it just by the clues that the author has presented to the reader. Now, if you've read really good detective stories, you know that the most enjoyable ones are where, as Stephen James says, the ending is inevitable but surprising. So there's some kind of twist that you didn't see coming, but you look back and you're like, oh, well, of course it had to happen that way. So it's not like a Deus Machina where you're like, where did that come from? Basically just a payoff without any kind of setup, but where there is some sort of surprise that happens, but you could still theoretically put it together like what happened. So with The Martian, you can start to think, oh, here's what's going to happen next, because I know how, potato growing works, or I know how, rocket fuel works or something. Like you could take one aspect and sort of make predictions. But I think, Stephen, you talked about it's sci-fi for nerds. I think that's also true. I think when there's a lot of numbers or equations, that also gives it away. And that's what people might call technobabble. But the one example I want to give is Kim Stanley Robinson's book. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's Neil Stephenson's book, Seven Eves. It's where it begins with the moon exploding for some reason, and humans have to survive because now all these moon asteroids are going to collide with the Earth, and they create this gigantic orbital space station. And so, in other words, there's no warp drive, there's no interstellar travel, there's no teleporters. There's only like our modern day technology, but maybe like a little bit more advanced, but very believably advanced. And so the whole book is it's almost like an engineering manual. It's like how they build all this stuff. And you kind of forget some of the characters. Like I kind of remember these little moments, but I'm like, wait, where were their names? And why do I care about them? And like, what made them different from the other person? So sometimes you kind of lose characterization and like personality, because the engineering is sort of the main character of the story.
That's a really great difference there, Zach. And of course, the story has to have human characters, but they are the supporting cast. Science, TM, or the science is the star, or humanity may be the star. But particular humans get kind of lost in the shuffle. That's not the case with The Martian, although it is very hard science fiction, but it is very hard personable science fiction. Like there's actual math in there. Yes. Mark Watney, by the way, I remember his name, which is a great sign that this was a very character-focused story. Mark Watney has done the calculations for how many grams of protein do I need? What's the most efficient plant I can grow given the resources that I have? The Martian is, at least at first, like basically this giant escape room. And he's trying to use all the components around him to survive. And we root for him because, he is representative of humanity on Mars. And so he's got all these human failings and he's got a snarky voice and all this. But you also root for the people back on Earth, including some future versions of, or near future versions of modern nations who are trying to get him home. And it's a great story. And by the way, Christian readers beware. If you were marooned on Mars, you would say all those words too. Okay, you can get home and confess them later to your pastor. But there's a lot of F-bombs in there, and if you don't like that, read Project Hail Mary, and you'll find these much more wholesome. Which is also a very hard science fiction story, but very speculative too. These basically made up an entire species of molecules that's literally going to blot out the sun. But not to nerd out too much, I think when I think of hard sci-fi, science is mainly the star, humanity too, but you just kind of forget the human names. And a really great example of that too is Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke in 1973.
I was going to bring that one up.
Yep. The star and the thing you see on the cover is rivets, like that book Papa Bear was reading. I think he was reading Rendezvous with Rama. There's this giant cylindrical spaceship that's spinning, and it's got all the oceans and land masses and weird alien tech pinned up along the inside. So it's artificial gravity, and you spend multiple chapters just going down the staircases at the ends to try to get into the thing. I don't remember the names of the people there. They don't really matter. It starts off with, this is what happened to humanity. This is how we put together the Earth Defense Force to blast the asteroids, so we didn't have a crash landing on Italy like we did that one time. And here's the committees, and here's the countries. And then, by chapter 5, you're introduced to the captain. And He's just a placeholder. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not dissing. I'm just saying you got to go in with the right expectations. Also, hard sci-fi tends to be set in a future version of our own solar system, where it's the year 2125 or the year 3125. It's us in the future, even if Earth is way far out there and we've made it all the way to Alpha Centauri using some really fantastical motivation for the spaceships. But either way, our universe tends to be the setting there, or there's some universe very close to home. Generally, too, in hard sci-fi, whether or not the author is showing off all the math that he did, the heroes and the plot and the world at least tip their hats in the direction of physical laws. I think a really great example of this is the Expanse series by the two authors there. I think I remember actually in the first book, Leviathan Wakes, from there afterward, the two authors writing as one were saying, hey, we don't think we've written hard science fiction here, even though people say we have. Like, how does this engine work? We don't know. It just does. But it still feels like hard sci-fi, not only because it's kind of this hard-bitten. Yeah, exactly. And
right.
you feel, the phrase I like to use is you feel the machinery running. You don't know how it's running, but it is. The author has done the homework for you, or at least pulled off the bluff that he did. My favorite example there, too, is from switching to TV, Star Trek. Transporter beams, how do they work? Don't know. We've got an explanation in there. That's about it. But it feels plausible. And it's set in the galaxy that's our galaxy in the future, a few centuries. And yet they have to have a box with lights on it and imagined machinery to take care of something like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which holds that you could never, even giving this fantastical tech and data collection, reassemble a human being perfectly after the breakdown by the transporter beam. So they have a box called the Heisenberg compensator. And legend tells that some wag visited the set and saw the box and said, oh, how does the Heisenberg compensator work? And someone a bit annoyed told him, it works just fine. Thank you very much. So is that hard sci-fi? Well, it's hard, but the corners are kind of rounded. You know, it's there if you want to look for it, but you don't have to.
Yeah, Star Trek is soft sci-fi, and I'll die on this hill, and I'll talk about that in chapter 2.
But it's not as soft as Star Wars. Star Wars is barely sci-fi. It's fantasy with spaceships.
I think because it's, and I can't. I don't know if I'm stepping on where we're going too much, but it's definitely a spectrum. And honestly, it's also a spectrum that kind of depends on your current perspective. Because I'm thinking about members of my family who would think that everything that we're talking about is hard sci-fi. You know what I mean?
If it depends on where you're standing, doesn't it?
Exactly. It depends on where you're standing. And so for where I'm standing, which again, I am just even more convinced that I am outgunned in this conversation. However, I would have definitely said, oh yeah, Star Trek. I mean, like, it's not super hard sci-fi, but that's harder sci-fi. But I'm sure that if Zach and I were to get into it, I would lose that debate. I'm sure I would. But I'm glad to hear though that you said that about the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars, because I've almost kind of always thought Star Wars is fantasy with sci-fi furniture.
Just basically. Fantasy with sci-fi furniture. Exactly.
Oh, I totally accept that. Yeah.
Some of the stories notwithstanding, right? There are some stories that basically have very few. They have nothing to do with the Jedi. Now you can probably start saying, no, this is more but still softer sci-fi. But yeah, it's very much
the classic
a spectrum.
Hero's journey. Yeah,
it is.
So
that's
which
thing,
is more of a
right?
fantasy or a myth,
Which is a really good example. But I wonder though, could you map the hero's journey to a hard sci-fi? Can you think of a good example?
I think it'd be a lot harder.
Yeah, it's harder.
I don't think you can, because so here's another way I've thought about hard sci-fi. We've talked on the show a lot about biblical fiction, shows like The Chosen or movies like Prince of Egypt, where they take what we know for sure that's in the text and they don't violate that, but they imagine what else could have happened. And I see a lot of hard sci-fi this way. So it's like an imaginative version of an astronomy textbook. So there's a really great duology I read like this called Proxima and then Ultima. It's by Stephen Baxter. And this was right around the time that the Kepler Space Telescope was discovering all these exoplanets. We're like, wow, there's planets around basically every star we look at. And look, there's one around the closest star to us, Proxima Centauri, this red dwarf. And people have wondered, like, could life survive there? There's solar flares. It's really close. It's like always day on one side. It's always night on the other side. Well, Stephen Baxter wrote a fantastic novel imagining this. Like, what would happen if you were just dropped off on a spaceship on this planet? How would you survive there? How would you build anything civilization-wise there? And there's also some alien stuff, and there's some speculative, warp drive type stuff. So there's a few cheats, but it's basically, an imaginative science textbook. And there's also a cylindrical thing in the second book, like Stephen was talking about. So you get books like that where it's like they're just imagining the next step, or like Asimov's books about robots and the 3 laws of robotics. So taking that logical framework and saying, okay, how can I make a story within these sort of hard and fast rules? And when that's your starting place, it is very different than like the hero's journey, because the hero's journey, it's like, okay, here's this normal person going to a strange world. And, what do you have to encounter? Whereas a lot of sci-fi is like, well, we're going to go to a strange world, but we're going to have these very normal laws governing everything. And we might have more interesting people exploring it. Like Mark Watney is a very interesting person. He's not exactly an everyman. He's kind of like he's a very distinct personality, and so that one kind of blurs the line a little bit. I think with this, and Stephen said with The Expanse, also very memorable characters, also not too hung up on things, and so it's a good blend, I think.
Have both of y'all read iRobot?
I have not, actually. I've read some of his other books, but not that one.
So I'm behind on my classics. So no shame, because I'm behind on my sci-fi classics, and I had only recently picked up iRobot. I think I read it about a year ago. I'm telling y'all, that book could have been published yesterday. It is amazing how I think it was published in like 1950 or something like that, and it could have been published yesterday. Both in the writing voice, it did not drag like an older book. It wasn't like super long run-on sentences or anything like that. But also, he doesn't say. I don't think he says the words artificial intelligence anywhere in the book. Other than that, seriously, it could have been published yesterday.
Wow.
But I wanted to ask you that because look at me. I'm more interested in what y'all have to say than what I have to say. Do we have good examples of hard sci-fi literally impacting science? Like, has hard sci-fi ever opened someone's eyes to a possibility that then caused some time? Okay, yeah,
absolutely, yes. And we'll save some of these, I think, and there will be, listeners, a sequel episode to this one. What is hard science fiction? Either Zach and I will give it a go on our own, or we'll find a good guest to talk about that. A few examples are the technology we're using right now. For example, digital audio. Was inspired, or at least digital music. The MP3 file format was inspired by a single episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where Lieutenant Commander Data is streaming multiple songs at the same time, and as an android, it can listen and isolate all of them at the same time, and he can just layer them over top of one another with specific voice instructions to the computer. And at least that, in part, inspired the creation of the MP3 file format, digital music. So that's extraordinary. The flip phone, inspired by Captain Kirk's communicator, and Star Trek alone has driven so many of these. Tablets, they were in Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Because here's what I'm wondering: like when we're kind of splitting the difference between hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi, I find myself literally just in this moment wondering, maybe what we should also be asking ourselves is, how does it affect the people who read it? Because it seems to me that that soft sci-fi may change the way that you think about yourself. Hard sci-fi may change the way you think about the world and what we can do in it. Right,
that's a good distinction.
That's a good way of putting it.
Whether it's internal or an external, but this also maps to what Zach was saying about the hero's journey. The hero's journey is about yourself. It is about growing and changing, right, as a person, and that's probably harder to map to hard sci-fi because that's not the focus so much. The focus is more, what can we do? What can we achieve, and let's open our eyes to those kind of possibilities. So,
worldview,
I think that's another way to look at it.
Worldview plays a big part in that as well. And let's get into that in chapter 2, where we're talking more specifically about how we define soft science fiction. But now let's talk about fantasy real quick. Not any kind of science fiction for our second sponsor, Lori Christine, who has written Garden of Mysteries, a Dragon Slayer Bible story, new middle grade biblical fiction with a fantastical twist, an ancient curse, an invisible dragon, a mysterious prophecy. Seth's parents have secrets they won't share with him. Why did the king kick them out of the garden and curse the land? And can the curse be broken? Finding answers to Seth's questions will prove more dangerous than he imagined. Can he discover the truth before the dragon destroys him? Frank Peretti meets the chosen for kids in this adventure-packed middle grade novel that will inspire readers to identify lies of the dragon and to put their trust in Jesus, the Dragon Slayer. Garden of Mysteries, the Dragon Slayer Bible story, is now available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to check out the companion devotional for Garden of Mysteries, sold separately on Amazon. Learn more at dragonslayerbible.com. You can also find that link in our show notes for this episode 246, or click the sponsor page to see that amazing cover for Garden of Mysteries. Clint, chapter 2.
Great. That sounds great, but am I allowed to interrupt to say that sounds awesome?
Yeah, you can. It is awesome. No, absolutely.
Fantastic.
And that's why we do these sponsor reads in the middle, because I like to work them into the conversation when I can, which does fit with chapter 2. How then do we define soft science fiction? So, Clint, you were mentioning earlier that softer science fiction tends to be a little bit more encompassing of the human hero's journey and encourages the reader to look inward and to grow as a person. Whereas harder science fiction tends to be about bigger ideas, humanity, our aspirations, even worldview challenges, religion and science and philosophy and all those sorts of things. So all of those are of benefit to the Christian. But in this case, you've got then this fantasy that is about the Garden of Eden and about those bigger questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my origin? Why do I have these temptations? And for that, we go first to Scripture. We go to the power of story, in this case, the true story, to explain those things. But softer science fiction can also then ask not just about the past or the present, but about possible futures or even other worlds. For example, it's unheard of, I think, for a harder science fiction novel to have a dragon on the cover, like Laurie Christine's book would. But a softer sci-fi novel might have a dragon on the cover. It just might be a dragon in a mech suit, or maybe there's an astronaut versus a dragon or something. Softer science fiction could have different things on the cover. Maybe even a swooning couple, like a Mama Bear's book. I think she was really enjoying that, and maybe she's willing to read more about spaceships if the story is much more about humans. There may be human beings on the cover of a softer sci-fi novel, like there is for Echo Nova. That's Dash right there, I presume, right there on the cover, about to do a time jump.
I hope so.
It could be fantasy with spaceships. It could be fantasy. I mean, there's some Star Trek episodes that are just fantasy with spaceships, and then there's others that are harder. It celebrates all those different subgenres. There may be another planet on the front. The planet may have dragons living on it. There may be a little tech jargon, but it's much more like Clint was saying earlier about time being like a river and the way that the ripples work upwards from the past into the present and the future. People tend to speak more in similes to imagine those sci-fi concepts, whereas a harder sci-fi novel may be perfectly fine pausing the whole story to talk about the equations behind the space elevator. That's what I remember from Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars, is let's grind this whole thing to a halt and talk about the space elevator and exactly what would happen if somebody who doesn't like the space elevator blows up said space elevator. How exactly would it fall to the surface? Where would it impact? How much would it smash on the way down? And how far would the dust cloud and debris ejecta travel? I remember that very vividly. I don't remember the math. I just remember the concept. Do I remember the people in that book? No. And usually I like to remember the people in the book because not just because we're Christians and we like people more than stuff, even more than math, but because people are easier to access. Like Clint, you're talking about the time travel, but the story doesn't, like I said, it doesn't lead with time travel. It leads with Dash Keen. Here's his situation. Here's his challenges. We'll talk more about that in chapter 3. But there's other stuff you may find on the cover. And I'm curious, like Zach, you like hard sci-fi, but I know you read some of the softer stuff too.
Oh, yeah.
Steampunk, superheroes, alternate future realities. Like, what's on your shelf, Zach, that might be classified as more softer science fiction?
Yeah, I've got the Dune verse. I've got a lot of the Star Wars extended universe. Blake Crouch, who's kind of more like techno thrillers, so a little bit like Michael Crichton, but more character driven. Books by Steve Raza, Orson Scott Card, The Ender's Game. I think those are much softer sci-fi. And even some cyberpunk, the Blade Runner type books, some of those can actually be quite soft in terms of sci-fi because it's more about kind of man versus society, a dystopian type story. It's not really about how the neural implants or whatever work. It's about, kind of the rage against the machine type story. But I do want to say my thing about Star Trek. And I think you're right, Stephen, that some Star Trek episodes are hard, some are soft. The one that I think is just blows all of these categories open is the episode called Rascals. And it's where Captain Picard, Ro Laren, Guinan, and Keiko all become children through a transporter accident. My kids love this episode. We've watched this so many times. And then these
and that's what I told myself. It's for the kids. It's for the kids.
Yeah, it's exactly for the kids. Because the kids have to save the day in this episode.
That's the Jar argument right there. You be careful.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to see my father. I want to see him now. Now.
You're my number one dad. And there's a scene where so the Ferengi have taken over the ship. Riker is trying to sneakily get a message or unlock something for the child Picard, who's stuck in the childcare room. But what he's doing on the surface is teaching the Ferengi guy how to use the Enterprise. And so he unlocks the computer, and then he says, "Okay, Morta, the Enterprise computer system is controlled by 3 primary main processing cores, cross-linked with redundant Melicort's Ramostat 14 kiloquad interface modules. The core element is based on an FTL nanoprocessor with 25 bilateral calolaterals, with 20 of those being slaved into the primary Heisenfram terminal. Now, you do know what a bilateral calolateral is, right?" And then Morta says, "Well, of course I do, human. I am not stupid."
He just technobabbles the enemy to stall for time.
Yes.
In
I love
universe,
it.
it's wonderful.
It's incredible. And it's like it's making fun of itself. Like it's because Star Trek is so many episodes are like that. They just throw out this jargon. You're like, okay, at least they know what it means. And then you finally get a guy that's like, I have no idea what any of that means, but I'm going to pretend like I know.
So I got to say, though, there's a little bit of plausibility even in Riker's stall for time technobabble there, because he's using like really huge measurements for data, but they are recognizable English or Latin or whatever the root there, kiloquads and, gigahertz and all of that. Like those are at least derivatives of modern measurements right now for data and processing. So it's still plausible.
Just be careful. You'll blow up the entire ferromactral drive. Yeah.
I don't think you convinced me.
Convinced you of what? Okay, how are you not convinced, Clint?
I don't think you convinced me because those were a lot of words that sounded right, but that I did not understand. So to me, I'm like, boy, that sounds like hard science.
It's Harry Potter in space. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
it's Harry Potter in space. He's just casting a spell with nonsense abracadabra words. That's all it is.
It's funny though. You said when you said Dune, and I actually agree with you. Like if I'm putting Dune on one shelf or the other, I do put Dune on softer sci-fi. But when idiot Clint was like Googling what is hard sci-fi, what is soft sci-fi, Dune popped up on both searches. Just
here's why, because it feels hard blend. Because
it does.
The universe is hard. It's gritty. There's sand. It's rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. There's a lot of philosophy. So you could say hard philosophy sci-fi. And it's not hard science sci-fi. How do the ships work? Giant, highly evolved human beings in a tank. I think. I don't even think that the first
on
2 films showed those things.
Kind of on
basically,
drugs.
lots and lots of very mystical, very 70s. And I think the David Lynch movie actually showed those guys, and the clips are legend to this day. But there's nothing hard about that at all. Oh yeah, you actually see these blobs.
I've never seen the old one.
Blob thing opens an aperture and shoots out a beam of light, and then the ship just dissolves, and that's kind of the extent of the budget. Yeah, that's soft, even though it just feels strange. Soft can be strange and can feel hard, but it ain't. Like Dune's got hard philosophy and hard situations, but it's not hard science fiction.
Right, but you're right. But it feels like it, like at first glance, sort of, right? It feels like it would be hard sci-fi, but I agree with you. I think that the essence of the story is definitely on the softer side.
Battlestar Galactica is another good example of where it looks hard,
example.
but it feels soft because, okay, you've got these situations where what happens if we lose atmosphere in this cargo bay, and how do we what do we do, and so they've really thought through that kind of stuff. But then they've got these like ghosts that show up and talk to people and visions and
all the Starbucks stuff.
No sense.
I only know the new one. I never saw the old one actually, so I don't know if the old one
I'm talking
was
about the new one.
Kind of like yeah. I don't know if the older one was more hard, cut and dry, whatever. But yeah, the new one definitely, especially the later seasons.
And we've got these robots that believe in God or gods, and they look exactly human, but there's really no way to tell. So it's not that sciencey when it comes down to it. It looks very sciencey, but and then like when they jump, the FTL kind of jump things, it's just this thing that happens. Like now there are like limits so I think the best soft sci-fi, it has like less explanation and less, there's no equations, there's no math, but the best soft sci-fi avoids plot holes that you could like point to and say, wait a minute, you set this rule up earlier and now you're just kind of violating that. And so I think that's the danger that some soft sci-fi can get into. I think somewhere in the notes Stephen had mentioned Back to the Future, and I think that's a good example of good soft sci-fi. It's like, well, how does the DeLorean work? Well, the flux capacitor. Okay, so he's got to fix that. And he's got to go 88 miles an hour. Yeah. But he just has to get struck by lightning. That'll work also. Or now he's got the Mr. Fusion thing. What does that need? It just needs trash. Okay.
It's so brilliant, like, by the way.
Yeah, like they set up these like little rules, and it's like, oh, well, don't go back and change anything or it'll affect things. Well, then they do that. And so there is sort of like nonsense to it in a sense, but there's also logic, like you said, Clint. There's you can follow it. You can at least say, hey, wait a minute, he can't do that, or he should do this. So as the reader, as the viewer, you can sort of make predictions about what's going to happen. And I think that is what differentiates it from fantasy, where with fantasy, like anything can happen. Like you don't know what's going to happen.
You still can't cheat the reader's intelligence just because you're doing soft sci-fi. It doesn't mean that you don't have to still have a logical story or suddenly they discover something at the end that they should have known all along and that fixes the problem. You can't do that, right? It's not an excuse to take the easy way out, basically, right? You still have to do the hard part of the magic trick of a story, which is essentially, like you said, that the best endings are the ones that should have been obvious but weren't, right? So you still have to have that internal logic throughout the story. It follows the rules and all the same things that you would have with any good magic system or truly any good hard sci-fi. You still have to follow those same principles. And if you do a good job of that, what I have found personally, so again, as a soft sci-fi writer, even some hard sci-fi fans will be cool with it as long as you don't pretend like you're something that you're not. If they know what they're getting into from the beginning, which is not something that I've ever had to think much about, it kind of just is the way that I write. I don't think I have to spend too much time worrying that I'm deceiving the reader one way or another. But if you are very upfront, this is the type of story that you're getting. I think a lot of hard sci-fi fans, some of them will say, okay, yeah, not for me. But a lot of them will be like, okay, I'm up for a ride, basically. That's how they'll think of it. So you'll still have a lot of readers who I think will still kind of go to both sides of it. Is this the right time to talk about handwavium? Because we mentioned the flux capacitor.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is, okay, who gets the honors, though? I feel like y'all should do it. This is your podcast. Y'all should introduce handwavium.
Well, I'm not aware of how handwavium works. I need to know the exact chemical composition of this mineral. I need to know where it came from. I need to know what the natives originally called it, what it is in Latin. I need to see it on the periodic table, or else I can't talk about handwavium.
So when I first learned about handwavium, y'all know Jody Lynn Nye? Have y'all ever come across Jody Lynn Nye? So she's an author who does a lot of teaching at conventions as well. And I did her workshop at Dragon Con, and she talked about handwavium, which I had never heard of before. And handwavium, and I'm reading this off of a screen. Handwavium is a fictional material with desirable properties that are impossible to obtain in the real world. And so this is too bad that people can't see me, but just imagine me just fluttering my hand in the air, because when somebody asks, how does that work? You say, it just works. And you just wave your hand. It just works. Okay, just trust me. And basically what we're saying is like, listen, for the good of the story, I'm trying to tell you a good story here. So just trust me. Time travel. Okay. Just trust me. Aliens, or just trust me. Teleport, whatever. Right. And the reader either says, yeah, okay, or no, not for me. And they close the book and they move on with their life. So the thing about handwavium, though, is you can really only get away with it. And I know this isn't a writer's podcast. I know this is for readers, but I think readers will appreciate this. The general idea is you can get away with one application of handwavium in a story, one conceit of like, listen, this is probably not actually possible, but let's just pretend that it is. Powered by handwavium. The flux capacitor is powered by handwavium. Time travel in my book is pretty much powered by handwavium. That is that one, hey, we're just going to agree to just go with this. And that's essentially what handwavium is. It is that powerful, impossible material that makes your crazy, fantastical story possible.
I love to save handwavium for limited circumstances too. I think, Clint, that's where the cover, you mentioned earlier, expectations, the cover image of the book really helps there. You look at Echo Nova, it's got these awesome, crimson over black patterns, but you've got some stars of the show, the human stars right there on the cover. I don't see a time machine on the cover. I see the effects of it. And I see this swirling, wormhole looking apparatus on the platform. This looks like an adventure is about to ensue. And so that is the hook. Similarly, with above the circle of Earth, I put even in the original descriptions, like I don't want just a spaceship on the cover. Part of a spaceship would be great to see, but I want to see human beings there. Can we do human beings and a spaceship? Just to make it absolutely clear, the human beings are the star of the show. Whereas in what people would say a hard science sci-fi book, the science and the philosophy are the stars. So I'd almost want to dispense with the whole idea of hard versus soft, because it's much more about not so much what the story feels like or whether or not the technology feels plausible, but who's the star? Is it the people, or is it the science or the philosophy, which is really kind of more the author? Who's the star of an Arthur C. Clarke novel? It's probably Arthur C. Clarke. He's kind of the main character there, and his ideas about philosophy and science fiction and all that. Clint, you mentioned iRobot. Who's the star of that? Well, the movie star is Will Smith, but the star of the book is probably Isaac Asimov.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
whereas
because it's actually a collection of stories.
Keen. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, think about a rocket ship that goes up. Are we focused on the astronaut who goes in the rocket ship or the billionaire tourist who's going with them? Whose POV do we see that journey from? The engineer with the PhD in mechanical engineering that's operating everything and he knows every button and what it does, or just the billionaire, guy that's right along for the ride and kind of funding the whole thing, and he's looking out the window and just citing poetry and just saying wow, or like this one video I watched, the person started crying, but in 0G your tears can't go anywhere, and so that was the thing that this person talked about, and they're talking about what it means to be in space, rather than like how I get to space. It's more like why we're going to space. And so I think it's very much who the POV character is in the story that tells you what type of a story it is.
Stephen, which shelf would you place your book on?
So that's interesting. That'd be difficult. Are there shelves? Like, do the libraries make you place it on a hard sci-fi shelf?
They don't.
Yeah,
but
if
they
let's
did,
just
pretend.
Yeah, I'm gonna want the middle shelf, my friend. I'm gonna want that there. And
Come on.
Okay, so
pick a
here,
side.
Nah, I can't do that. No, here's the side. Which of you among us said earlier a story that feels like hard sci-fi but is actually soft? I would class Above the Circle of Earth as that, because it is about the human beings. And came up with this imagery not too long ago when I was just sending out another update, by the way. You should be able to get that now at estephenburnett.com. The ship of the novel has three main levels in it. There's command deck, living deck, and labor deck. Command deck, that's where the captain is. That's where the executive functions are. That's where the plot gets determined. So if you're into a plot-driven story, you're going to head to command deck. This is where the adventure gets planned and where you decide how to fight the bad guys. But if you're into more softer sci-fi, more human relationships, you'll want to stay on living deck. That's where the cabins are. You can get to the galley. You can sit in front of the fireplace. And in the future version of the ship, there will be real physical fireplaces on living deck. I'll make it work in space. Trust me. Handwavium. That's where the restrooms are, the workout room, the medical bay, that's where all the human drama happens, mostly on living deck. And you can take comfort in the fact that just below your feet, a few meters down, there's sort of a gentle hum. Because the engines and all the stuff, the utilities, everything that makes it work, the deuterium, the stellarator, all the fusion propulsion, that's going on labor deck. You don't have to go down to labor deck if you don't want to. But trust me, it's there. Our characters go down to labor deck a few times, especially when things go wrong. But you have to open the hatch and go down there. If you want to stay on living deck and just be confident that the author is handling things below labor deck, great. But if you want to go down there and talk about Martian calendars and debate whether or not quantum vaulting could work, you can do that. I think quantum vaulting, by the way, is my only handwavium. It's plausible, but what's the purpose of it? How does it work? It works by moving hero A from point one to point two. I need to get him there in a hurry. Okay. We can't take 6 months and wait for a Holman transfer to get from Earth to Mars, even with the fastest propulsion systems. I needed to go faster. Otherwise, all the technology is fairly plausible, even the development of fusion energy and stuff. So
it is.
Yeah, that's why I want to stick it really stubbornly right in between hard and soft.
I know.
Clint.
Well, it's no, you're right, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on your podcast. I've read your book, and I think you're going to make both audiences happy. I really do mean that. So. I think you're right about that. I wish you would have picked a side. Although I agree with you that probably, maybe you're putting it in the middle, but I think it's like tilted for the softer sci-fi.
Clint, if the librarian isn't thinking clearly, they'll put it on the inspirational shelf.
That's where mine is. That's where Steel Fire. If you go to our county library, Steel Fire is on the inspirational shelf.
Maybe we could just move it when they're not looking. Don't tell them I
maybe done that. I've maybe done that before. If nothing else, I at least pull it and turn it face out.
In the computer,
it's just a robot among bonnets. Is just on that inspirational.
It's a little handwavium there. No shade on the bonnets, but sometimes you need a little android skull under the bonnets to make things interesting. Amish vampires from space. TM. Another issue there is that Christians, and I'll talk more about this later, but Christians in particular, like, we're not sure what to do with hard sci-fi. It feels kind of humanist, and spoiler alert. A lot of it is. Isaac Asimov literally led like the American Atheist Society and opposed prayer in schools. He was el numero humanisto and wrote great stories, but had very bad religion. Carl Sagan, same thing. Arthur C. Clarke, same thing. They wouldn't mind talking about religion, but a lot of the time they were trying to deconstruct it. And that's just a fact. Some of the Star Trek episodes are the same. God is misused. His title is misused in The Martian. But he's nowhere near the place. And Christians think, well, we got to have stories that acknowledge God, the creator in some way. But sci-fi does have roots in genres, pulp and otherwise, that took things in a very secular Enlightenment direction. So there is that stigma there, even more than there is for fantasy. But that doesn't mean that we cannot have harder or softer, more human, more sciencey science fiction for the glory of God.
Of course not. I mean, and again, I'm ill-equipped to talk about this because it's not me. However, and I know I came on to talk about softer sci-fi, and I feel like I'm talking more about harder. I mean, if anyone, we should be the most interested in science and how God created the world and the universe and all of these beautiful things. We should be studying it. I'm not. We should be studying it the most. You know what I mean? That's not who I was made to be. But
humanity, though, yes,
right, exactly. Because I mean, the more that we study it, the more that we can see the beauty of creation. So I'm with you that I do think that there's that stigma is there, and maybe rightfully so because of so much of the work that has been done in kind of on that side of the genre. But I agree with you. I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. And I think that there's plenty of room for a faith-based harder sci-fi.
I think a lot of the stigma goes away depending on what profession people are in. So people I know that work for SpaceX or NASA or, engineering firms or big tech companies, Christians, I mean, they're fine, reading hard sci-fi books. And yeah, they may not like some of the humanist philosophy or the language or the other content, but it really speaks to them in a way. It's like, hey, my education was important. Like, I can understand all of this. Or, it's like a mystery that I'm trying to solve, but with physics. And so I think but it's sort of kind of limited to those little pockets. And, Stephen, I'm glad you brought up The Expanse, because I remember this interview from a decade ago with the authors of The Expanse, where I think this was at a Google presentation. And they said, people classify us as hard sci-fi because we don't try to cheat gravity. Like, we have artificial gravity from like rocket thrust, like from acceleration, like you would in the real world. But a lot of hard sci-fi is not very character driven, and it's kind of like what we said. And they're like, we wanted to do the opposite of that. We wanted to tell a really good story with really memorable characters. And so that, I just think soft sci-fi is just sci-fi for normies, who aren't the PhD engineering guys. Just the average person can enjoy a lot of soft sci-fi. So even though they would not classify it, so they wouldn't classify it as hard sci-fi, and the way that they introduce some of those concepts, it's understandable to most people. And so that's, it can be very hard in a sense, but it doesn't appear that way.
Let's pause for our third sponsor, Sunrise Publishing, with Jill Williams's new novel, Squire of Truth. We just had Jill on the show last week, and that novel just released in January. Another installment in Jill Williamson's Blood of Kings universe, starting with her debut, By Darkness Hid. By the way, from the first version of the publisher that Clint and I share. It's a former name, now known as Enclave Publishing. This book is a different one. Cole has journeyed far from his days as a stray stable boy in a distant mountain village. Haunted by failures on the battlefield, he seeks solace in music. But when the songstress he spent a fleeting evening with shows up at his doorstep, Cole may have gotten more than he asked for. Amidst the turmoil of a looming royal wedding and the threat of dark magic, Cole and Mistel must unravel the mystery of a brutal murder before they become the next targets in a deadly game of power. Return to the world of Eretz in Squire of Truth, a murder mystery romantasy from award-winning author Jill Williamson, and the first installment in the epic Blood of Kings Legends series. We've got that cool cover. We've got the links to go buy this book in the show notes for this episode 246, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Clint, Chapter 3, when does Echo Nova feel like softer sci-fi? So, of course, we've already talked about all of this, some of it. We can't help ourselves, but I want to start with asking you probably the most important question. Let me pull this up here real quick. Yeah, Clint, how exactly do you pronounce that name from your back cover that I mangled earlier while you were so patiently waiting in the wings? Mr. Mizablik. Oh, no, that's a Superman villain. Mr. Mirtram. How do you say this?
Pretty good. By the way, Jill's the best. Just since you missed her a second ago, she's like one of the first people who welcomed me when I came into like Railmakers and stuff. Jill's absolutely fantastic. Same. Okay, yeah. So I am like the least worried about the way that people pronounce things in my books. And so Stephen knows this.
So what did your audiobook narrator say when you said that?
Well, no, I did do this. So this is the thing, right? So for people who don't know, pull back the curtain. We have to make a pronunciation guide, which I had no idea how to do. As a matter of fact, I was using my son's Pokemon book because it actually does the phonetic spelling for all these different, and I was like pulling like how to do phonetic spelling from this Pokemon book when I was trying to say like how you pronounce these people's names. But I'm actually not, I don't think there's a single word in any of my book that I'm like, it has to be pronounced like this. However, that one I've always said is Mirtram. It's
easy once you know how.
I have only heard a sample of the audiobook, and Mirtram is not in that sample. It's like the very, very beginning. I don't think it's been shared yet, but this isn't like a big secret. And probably by the time this comes out, actually the sample will be out.
We should all be able to buy the audiobook.
Buy the audiobook, y'all. The audiobook will be, people buy the audiobook. Come on. Are y'all big audiobook guys? I'm a big audiobook guy.
I'm an audiobook fiend. I've got my Audible subscription. I get a lot of books read that way.
So I always say Mirtram. I just thought, I thought, whatever. This isn't a spoiler, but I thought it was clever making his name a palindrome because of his role in the story. But yeah, so his name is Mr. Mirtram. But here's the thing. I haven't heard how my audiobook narrator actually pronounces it yet. I sent the pronunciation guide. I tried to convey Mirtram through, written text. So however he says it, his name's James. James Fouhy or Fauhi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. However James decided to say it is going to be the official canon way of saying that name. So if you want to figure out the answer to the question of how I should be pronouncing my own character's name, go listen to the audiobook and we'll all find out together because I'm not really sure.
Well, we'll need to find out too once your narrator sends you the pronunciation guide for his name. Turnabout is fair play after all.
I know. That's so embarrassing that I don't know that because I have heard it said, and now just in the moment I'm trying to remember what it would be. But anyways, by the way, he did a fantastic job. I've listened to the sample, and this was 100% the right choice. So I'm thrilled that we were able to get him this book.
Awesome. I'd love to do more behind-the-scenes stuff about audiobooks, by the way, because I'm also in that process, just a few months behind you. But speaking of running, Dash Keen is used to running. This is a human-centered story, so it goes ahead and kind of puts it on the shelf there from the cover and the back cover, letting readers know of the Enclave Escape imprint, which, by the way, should tell you, hey, this is for YA. This is for teenage readers, younger readers. We're not getting to a lot of flow charts about time travel here. This is more of the accessible stuff because this is about a human hero with human struggles. How did you come up with this story and this lead hero, Dash Keen?
This was so long. I wrote this book 7 years ago, I think, and it's just been kind of sitting on a shelf. I had a couple of offers from it, and I was very grateful for those offers, but it wasn't the right offer at the right time. And then finally, it was right publisher, right place, right time. And as a matter of fact, when I submitted Steel Fire to Enclave, I was actually like figuratively holding both manuscripts, looking at them, saying, which one am I going to send first? And I decided to go with Steel Fire because Steel Fire is a little bit more of a faith-based story, a little bit more of a serious story. Echo Nova, the element of faith is certainly present in Echo Nova, but it's not as heavy of a theme as it is in Steel Fire. That's why I led with Steel Fire. But this one, I kind of did grassroots in a lot of ways. I mean, which is to say that I was at a whiteboard thinking like, I want to do a time travel story. I love time travel stories. What is it though that I can bring that's different, And it's because in so many time travel stories, it's the thing of like, got to be careful when you go back because if you step on the wrong grasshopper, you might like erase yourself from existence or something. And by the way, I'm not saying anything against those stories. I love those stories, but I wanted to change it. And so I was like, what if the changes never caught up, right? And it brought into it brought. I'm a world builder first. I usually have my world and my concept before I start thinking about my characters. So it brought into idea like, okay, well, if those changes to the past didn't impact the future, would we consider it to be real? Or I should say the present. If it didn't impact the present, would we consider it to be real? If you go back and you do something, you change something, but it has no impact on our current reality, is it actually real? And what I sort of decided was that it would be awful convenient for us to say, no, it's not real, because then we can go do whatever we want. Now, this is the central question of the story, and I won't give away too much. I'm sure people can kind of see where I'm leading, right? But it is certainly beneficial to large groups to say, no, of course it's not real. We can do whatever we want to it. And that's kind of what happens in this story. And the story is sort of it challenges our perceptions of reality, and it challenges sort of our perceptions of human empathy, right? In terms of, what we are willing to subject other people to if it benefits us. Mertram, and I wish I could talk more about Mertram. For people who have pre-ordered the book, we're going to do a big spoiler chat, because I want to go into a lot of the stuff behind Mertram. But that's a lot about the story. Now, with Dash himself, though, I have always been very goal-oriented, very ambitious, very driven. But I think I was realizing that my priorities maybe were misaligned, that I was very worried about, hey, I want to be special. And for me to be special, I have to prove it through achievement, right? And so I had it backwards, that for me to have worth, I had to achieve, and achievement would give me significance, and the significance would give me worth. Christians, I hope Christians listening. Oh, you know what? I hope everybody listening. There's probably at least a handful of non-Christians that are listening to your episodes. I hope everybody knows that that's backwards. Even if you don't believe what I believe, I hope you know that that's backwards. You have worth because you're who you are. Now, for the people who believe what I believe, is because we are sons and daughters of God. We have worth. And then we are given significance because of that. And anything that we are able to achieve is a result of that, worth. Anything good that we're able to achieve, I should say. But this book was a lot about me sort of wrestling with that desire to earn love and earn a perception of value and earn a perception of worth through notoriety, through achievement, through fame, right? I mean, every author wants their book to be big. And this book was me working through that. And now here's the thing. That sounds really heavy. This is a super fun, fast-paced book with like temporally displaced sea dinosaurs and gunslingers and crazy stuff like that. And if you want to read it that way, that's totally the way that you can read it. But that's kind of the story behind the story. And that's really where I was at the time, and something I was thinking about. And it's the reason why, even though I actually wrote this book before we had our first child, we have 2 sons, I have since decided that I was going to dedicate it to them. And Steel Fire was very much about me going through a personal crisis of faith. So it's kind of a story for me. I've now realized that maybe more than anything I've ever written, this is the story that I want to these are the things that I want to say to my sons. So that's why I've dedicated Echo Nova to my sons, because I want them hopefully to know from an earlier age that they don't have to achieve their worth. They don't have to prove it, that they already have worth, and that anything that they do is, that's a result of the fact that they already have worth as sons of God.
Zach, Clint's an even better guest than I thought he would be. And Echo Nova is a better subject for this topic of soft science fiction, because what Clint has just done there, all on purpose, I'm sure, too, is write a story that is about the difference between soft science fiction and hard science fiction. You have here now a time travel technology being used by a corporation for entertainment, and they're probably getting wrapped up in all the bells and whistles and the boxes with lights on them. And cool, we have time travel. Let's go back and have us a competition. And then it doesn't really matter if we mess something up, because, the ripples are not going to be felt here in the future. It's negligible. That army was going to die anyway, for example. Now, that makes me think then about the applications here. Now you've got a hero who, and then we see that right there in the back cover, who's starting to empathize with the people of the past. Is it right to treat them so casually and so cavalierly for the sake of human achievement? Now, if you're to generalize hard science fiction, you would say it is about humanity. It's about human achievement as a species. One thinks of Dr. Weston's monologue in the Ransom trilogy, especially in the first one, where, hey, I'm doing this for humanity. We got to colonize other planets for humanity. And then the angel who rules Mars says, well, you say you care about humanity, but you kidnapped a guy and you don't care about him personally. So I love this idea of a hero who starts empathizing with individual humans made in the imago Dei, the image of God, over and against this goal of entertainment or human ambition using a technology like time travel. Zach, what did you think just hearing that difference there?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what we were saying. Is this science fiction going to inspire a new invention or a changed life? And it sounds like it's the second one. And so I think that's a good way to kind of understand these differences. And that sounds really cool, that this is a sort of a love note to your kids and what you want them to wrestle through in their lives. And the story is a way to get them to engage those ideas and those themes. By the way, Stephen, a totally side note here. I just realized that the Left Behind series is hard Christian fiction because it relies on flowcharts.
Oh, so many flowcharts, exactly. And there's Heisenberg compensators, and there's exegetical parameters, and probably some dual quad processors with emergency backups and everything. Yeah, it really is. And then you have to pause the story for some very long explanations about theology, for theobabble. That's a little different than technobabble. Actually, Clint, that's how I explained when I was talking about Above the Circle of Earth earlier. I said, hey, the story may have some theobabble, but it's got to fit the story. If not, it's got to be cut. The author got distracted by some cool theology that doesn't really relate to the human beings. Got to relate to the human beings. Got to relate to their growth. Well, we look forward to reading Echo Nova or listening to Echo Nova. There's a lot more to be said there about soft sci-fi, hard sci-fi. Clint, I know we're going to have you back to talk about this or whatever else might be ahead for you, but let's get a prediction of the future, since you did some time traveling with the shiny box with lights, powered by handwavium. Clint, what's next for you other than talking about Echo Nova, getting that out there, having some more human-centered sci-fi?
Yeah, what's next for me? So right now it's mostly just thinking about, it's so weird because you spend I've had this book in my digital shelf for 7 years. And even since it got contracted about a year and a half ago, it's all been about production. It's so weird because then when the book actually releases, you feel like you're done. You're not done.
Now that it's over, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life.
That's right. So for the time being, I'm doing some conventions and sort of things like that with Echo Nova, a couple book signing events, that kind of thing. What's next? And again, I believe in being extremely authentic. I'm not currently contracted for anything else, and I'm not sure what the next thing is. I've got some things that I really want to do. So I told you that Steel Fire was the story that was kind of for me. I told you that Echo Nova, I have since realized, is the story for my sons. I have another story that is more than anything I've ever written. It is what I want to say to the world. I don't know I don't know when the right time for that book's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be my next book. I don't know what that's going to do. I am trusting God, so I have trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own. So I have to learn scripture by music. Have you ever come across verses that this group that like does put scripture to music? I've always had a hard time memorizing scripture. But I found this thing. And so I've got this playlist. So it's hard for me not to sing this, but anyways, it's trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him and he will make straight your path. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm thinking about that a lot. I don't know what the next book's going to be. I've got a lot of things on the shelf and I'm just trusting God. But and the other thing though, too, is I have young sons right now. And if God tells me we're going to wait a minute. And instead of having a book out every 18 months, you're going to be a dad for a while. And you're going to have these other great books, which, by the way, like Steelfire, still new. It came out like less than 2 years ago. But also maybe just pause for a while, because that's also part of the lesson that I learned writing Echo Nova is, again, that my worth does not come from achievement. And so I don't have to worry about what's the next thing that I'm going to do, the next thing I'm going to achieve. So I'm always writing, but I'm always writing because writing fills me up. Because, when I'm in worship service and God whispers in my ear, it's often book and story ideas. But I think that's the way that he teaches me and talks to me. So I'm always writing. I'm always working on things. I have some things that would fit very strangely into the Christian fiction genre, but are still stories that I want to tell. I have some things that I think might fit a little bit better, but we'll see. So I'm not being coy when I say I don't know what's next, because I truly don't know what's next, but I'm okay with whatever it is.
Well, in the meantime, you can follow Clint's work at clinthall.com. I see that he's also on Instagram at Clint Hall. That's easy to remember. He also has his own podcast, The Experience, Conversations with Creatives. Of course, Clint will have all those links in the show notes, along with your full bio and all the links to purchase Echo Nova, just released. And we are very grateful that for someone who does a lot of time travel, you cleared some time to arrive on our platform. And with that, best wishes, and we will replenish our in-house supply of handwavium and leap ya on out of here.
I really appreciate it. Seriously, I learn a lot listening to your podcast just in general. I have learned a lot just sitting and talking with both of you today, and I really, really appreciate that. I love that y'all are doing this. I love the way that y'all do this podcast. And so thank you so much for having me on to have this conversation.
Great having you. Well, to you, our listener, we would love to know, do you like hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, harder, soft, or some crunchy sci-fi, if that exists, or something that feels just right? Send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. We want to know which of these types of stories speaks to you the most. Like what makes you just so excited to sit down and read when you pick up a sci-fi off the shelf? So send us a note.
Notice that Zach called it X. I think enough time has passed. We can say X, formerly Twitter. It feels very hard sci-fi, even though it should be about human communication. I've enjoyed some time spent on there. And so, yeah, you can just see us there on at Lorehaven, rather. Hey, next on Fantastical Truth, speaking of trying to classify all these genres, that is a big part of what Lorehaven does. We curate the best Christian-made fantastical novels that we can find, and have been doing so now for 7 years at lorehaven.com and for 5 years with the podcast. So next week, to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of Fantastical Truth and that longer anniversary for Lorehaven, we're going to go behind the scenes at Lorehaven. How do we do those reviews? How are we doing the articles? What's next for us? How do we decide what to put together for this podcast? And what does the future look like for this mission to explore fantastical stories for God's glory? It looks like more of this podcast, and we're so grateful that you, our listeners, have joined us now for 5 years, almost 250 episodes, going back to that chilly January pre-lockdown in 2020. Thank you for joining us for this mission, for the hard topics, the sciencey topics, and the soft topics, the human topics alike. We look forward to another 250 some odd episodes, another 5 years, as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.